Welcome, everybody. Yeah, wait, there we go. That's what they need. Welcome, everybody, to those who are here in person and those online. My name is Ben Heckman. I'm the Bexley Public Library Director, and it's exciting to have everybody here. Springtime, we met the incredibly dynamic and amazing Michael Wilkos, and we formed a partnership that has changed how I personally view and see our area, Columbus, the surrounding areas, and as we're on the verge of voting for a lot of stuff, has shaped how I think and vote about things. Because you hear about growth in Columbus and it's not anywhere that people say it is. And I've learned a great deal from Michael Wilkos, who is the Vice President of Community Engagement at the United Way of Central Ohio. And I want to thank him for being here tonight for another round of this as we explore the growth of Columbus and what is going to be happening, whether we like it, know it, or want it. And so I think the more informed we all can be, the better we can make decisions and vote for things and support things and speak up to help the growth work for everybody and not just for a few. How's that intro?
That sounds great.
Was that okay? Was that good? Mm-hmm. He's accredited. I mean, look, I got a whole page here. He's the best. This is an important topic. And so I'm going to turn it over to him. And I think I want to thank the panel for coming tonight as well. I'm excited to be here to listen and learn.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ben. And good evening. For those of you that don't know, Mayor Kessler is in the room. Would you like to say hello? Anything?
Hi, I'm Mayor Ben.
Okay, Mayor Ben. There we go.
This is a really important topic.
So thank you again for coming out this evening. I'm going to spend just a few minutes to share some community data about what is happening in the housing ecosystem before I invite our panelists up to the stage. With that, clearly, we have been underbuilding housing. What I used to hear lots of people say is, who's going to live in all this stuff I see under construction? And the reality is, it's just not nearly enough. This is what's driving things for our community. We have grown by 263,000 people in a 12-year period, while the rest of the state has lost 20,000 people. What's happening in Central Ohio is not happening across the rest of the state. We have been stuck at about 9,000 units of production every single year between 2010 and 2020. We needed 14,000 units of production just to match the population growth. So every single year for a decade, we underbuilt housing by 5,000 units. How are we growing? 50% of our growth is we have more babies than people passing away every year. 26% are people who move here from another country, and 24% is because people who move to Central Ohio from somewhere else already in the US. Almost all of that is coming from Cleveland, Dayton, Akron, Detroit, and Youngstown. Construction surged in 2021 and 22. We got to 12,800 units. 2022 was the most amount of housing we had built in 18 years. But now the analysts are saying we should be building 21,000 units in order to make up for a decade of underbuilding. And then what happened last year? Construction fell. Land, lumber, labor, and interest rates really hurt the Columbus market. And so far in 2024, we're seeing even fewer units getting permitted than even last year. Not a good sign. What this means is in 2010, we had 107 housing units for every 100 households, a relatively decent regional housing market, giving us some availability by price and tenure. By 2020, we were here. That is why the housing market feels so tight for all of us. One of the things I want you to think about in this conversation is the movement from the words affordable housing, which always felt like we were talking about something for somebody else, but now we're all talking about housing affordability because it's impacting all of us. If we don't change our attitudes around building, we will only have 96 units of housing for every 100 households by the end of the decade. I don't think we've even seen what a bad housing market can really look like. This is where the Denvers, Austin, Seattle, San Franciscos, and LAs already are, which is why you see those regions with median home prices at 7, 8, 900,000 and a homelessness epidemic that may not be repairable. This is what it's done. It has pushed prices up. In red is the 1/3 tier of price points in Franklin County. The light blue runs closer to the county median, and the dark blue is where there is still value in the marketplace. These are price points unheard of in the Columbus market. And we've also seen this, the appreciation rates over the last 3 years. While the county went up 42%, not everybody increased at the same. Look at Grandview Heights. They went up only 17%, but Whitehall, just down the street, surged 68% in just 36 months, or Hamilton local. Why are places like Whitehall and Hamilton appreciating so much more quickly now? 2 reasons. They have lost the appreciation that they should have been receiving historically, as those communities were not valued in the marketplace. And over the last handful of years, they became the place where so many entry-level buyers was the only place they could find homes to buy. So they all rushed to those communities, pushing those prices up there really quickly. This map is more interesting to me because it removes political jurisdictions and it looks at where that property appreciation has been the highest. One of the things you'll notice, not a lot of color through the middle of Franklin County. That is the High Street spine from Worthington, Beechwold, Clintonville, Old North Columbus, Campus, Short North, downtown, German Village, Marion Village. That is the white, privileged spine of Franklin County that has always seen their property values increase. And what happened over the last cycle is the geography of that appreciation dramatically shifted into black and brown neighborhoods. And that's what you see on this map. You see places like Linden, south of Children's, over toward Franklinton, where the home appreciation rates were 100% in 3 years. Last year, 20% of every home purchased in the city of Columbus was purchased by a buyer who has 500 houses or more. And those buyers focused on black and brown neighborhoods where they perceived where the value was still in the housing market. And that's where a lot of flipping is now going on, really hurting those neighborhoods. I'm not going to get too far down a rabbit hole, but if we think about restrictive covenants and redlining, urban renewal, highway building, and busing, those tools by government have suppressed the home values in black and brown neighborhoods for many, many decades. Now the housing market is behaving in different ways. The growth of the city is accelerating. The growth is moving inward. And in my opinion, black and brown neighborhoods are being hurt like they always have. Now not as the neighborhood is being suppressed, but as the neighborhood is being pulled up by market values, it's still impacting brown and black people in more complicated ways. What our housing market has done, if you look at 2013, our housing costs were 2.7 times what we earn in an annual basis. And by 2023, Central Ohio housing costs were running 4.1 what you earn annually. We now have the same income to housing cost ratio as Chicago. In white, you see the Columbus Metro. In blue, you see all the places we have been pulling people in the state of Ohio to move here. Because our housing prices have jumped so much, and because COVID doesn't require a lot of us to go into work every day, it has caused, for the first time in history, the Columbus Metro in white is now losing population to the ring of counties just outside the metro, as people are trying to avoid Columbus's housing bubble. And if I only got to drive into downtown or OSU 2 days a week, I can go another 20, 30 miles further out. So COVID and our housing costs are causing an acceleration of sprawl to leave the metro. This scarcity of housing has pushed apartment rents up 56%, much faster than our incomes. And then while all housing construction fell, multifamily fell higher than single family last year. And one report ranked Columbus the 3rd fastest growing rents in the United States after New York City, northern New Jersey, as we ended out 2023. That is also contributing to this. We are on track to have a record number of evictions filed in history in Franklin County, and this is the geography of those evictions. It is going further out toward the Beltway, up toward 270. This is way out, Bexley sitting right here. Way out in Reynoldsburg is an epicenter of evictions, and out toward 70 and 270. Not Franklinton, Linden, and Children's Hospital. I interpret this map, people picking up and moving out of urban neighborhoods for whatever reason is motivating them. They get to their destination, they can't afford that decision, and they're falling victim to eviction. The other thing that is happening, low-income people, because of this housing scarcity, are being pushed into these deplorable market rate conditions owned by private sector landlords, and then government has to show up in the 11th hour and 59 minute and find places for people to go. In the case of Latitude 525 in Colonial Village, owned by the same landlord, and I don't want to misspeak, but I think the city of Columbus has spent X millions in dealing with Colonial. Six. The city of Columbus has spent $6 million in government money moving the residents out of Colonial Village, putting them in hotels, and then ultimately trying to find new housing for those individuals. And the last thing that is happening is what I call renovictions. Because the market is so scarce, Columbus is essentially now out of housing. These real estate investment firms will look at some of these apartment complexes built in the 1960s and 1970s. They will come in, buy the entire apartment complex, either cancel those leases, or they will wait for all of those leases to expire, and then they will choose to renovate the units, new carpet, new kitchens, raise those rents by hundreds of dollars. Again, low and moderate income communities, low and moderate income people are being hurt the most by our housing scarcity. We, in the last decade, used up 9,417 vacant homes in this community, meaning we repurposed them. There's very little vacant housing left anywhere in our city. What does this number on the left mean? Every single year for a decade, Franklin County was taking 900 housing units that were vacant and abandoned and repurposing them. So if I told you in the beginning we've been underbuilding by 5,000 units every year, well, we were helping with that underbuilding by reusing 900 properties that were already here by bringing them back online. Now, we don't have that vacant and abandoned housing to repurpose. So if we can't get production of housing up, we're going to really fall behind now. So that's a little citywide context to ground us in this conversation. With that, I know it's a real buzzkill. With that, I'm going to let our panelists come up. I will briefly introduce them as they are coming up, and I will have them reintroduce themselves. First will be Aaron Wasserman, with Director of Real Estate with Homeport. Come on up. Next is the other Aaron, which I'm going to refer to as Aaron Prosser. We'll go by Prosser for the rest of the night. She is Deputy Director of Development for the City of Columbus and focuses on all the affordable housing strategies. And last is Carly Booz, the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. Welcome, panelists. I think I'm going to go here. I'm going to take this. With that, I'm going to start with you at the far end, Carly, and just kind of reintroduce yourself. And, oh, the screen's going up. And just tell us, what do you do in your role? How long have you been in the affordable housing space? And what has motivated you to be in this career path? And that would be the same question for the remaining panelists.
Okay. So I will try and be brief, and I could sit here and do a biography all night, and probably will not get going. So I'm Carly Booz. I'm at the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio. We are a nonprofit organization. Our goal really is to make sure that Central Ohio has all of the data. Better?
Yeah.
As I was saying, the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio really wants to make sure that as a region, we have all of the data that we need, we have all of the research that we need to understand this problem, that we have people who are dedicated to educating others on it. It's great to have numbers and facts, but if you're not going out and talking about them, they're not doing anybody any good. and that's a role that we can play. And then at the end of the day, we're the cheerleaders for affordable housing. We know it is a problem that can be solved. We are constantly optimistic that we've got the right tools and the right leaders here to be able to do it. So we just want to go out and kind of create that energy and make sure that as folks are having these ideas and they want to be able to address the problem, that we can be a supporter and a technical assistant agent and just a helper. I've been at the Alliance for 4 years now. I've been housing my whole career. I was originally at the Legal Aid Society during the Great Recession, so my work was to represent homeowners who were facing foreclosure and make sure that they were able to protect their homes. And I really think that that's kind of what convinced me to stay in the field. I originally went to law school thinking I was going to be a tax lawyer and I was going to prosecute white-collar criminals, and then I found housing and it's much more interesting. And my career has followed along with the Great Recession ever since. So I did legal representation for a long time. I eventually moved over to the state, and I got to help write some of the policies that helped us recover from that recession. I became the policy writer for the state of Ohio and got to direct how their investments in affordable housing were made. And then eventually I went back to legal aid for a little in-between job where we helped set up an economic development team and provide free attorneys to nonprofits and small businesses who were trying to help the community until I found my way here. So thank you again for letting me join.
Hi, everyone. Yep, okay, that's working. My name is Aaron Wasserman. Nice to meet everyone. Thanks for coming out on a Thursday night. I work for Homeport. Homeport is a nonprofit organization that serves Central Ohio, mostly Franklin County. And one of our main programs is to build and own affordable housing. Often that means we're building homes to rent. Sometimes we're also building homes to sell to regular families to then own those homes. I am in charge of our real estate development. We have a whole group of folks on our staff who build, develop, and manage homes for the long-term future. So we sort of fuse real estate development, which at least in terms of caricature, is cutthroat, and civic or policy-oriented goals of Metro Columbus. And I've done this sort of work for about 15 years at Homeport and other organizations. Yeah.
Switch. Good evening. I was going to say good morning. It's good evening. I'm Erin Prosser. I'm the Deputy Director at the City of Columbus, focused on our housing strategies. I've been in the position since 2021, and it was a newly created position for the City of Columbus. And I think what was really recognized by leadership and by the administration at that time is that the housing challenge we were facing was much more broad than we had been just investing in up until that point. And how would we look at the broader marketplace? What could we do as a city to help facilitate more construction, build more housing to alleviate the pressure on the system? And then how do we also invest in projects like Aaron's in order to get that affordable housing into our communities throughout the City of Columbus? And I think as we think about affordable housing, we use that term, and I think the number one question I always get when I do any kind of speaking engagement is, what do we mean by affordable? And I think what is really tricky about this is it's all deeply personal to all of us as to what's affordable. What we want is families not paying more than 30% of your income on housing. And what that translates to for a lot of us is we are able to attain affordable housing. We're able to pick the neighborhood that works for us. We're able to pick the housing type that works for us and find it either an ownership or a rent that we can afford if you make a certain income in our community. For those folks in our community that are more vulnerable, for those folks who are in a more middle income bracket profession, like our social workers and our childcare employees, that becomes much more challenging to achieve in the marketplace. Partially because of what Michael described earlier and the inability to compete against some of the wealthier tenants or owners that want to also compete for that home. And I think when we look at how that impacts families, it's incredible, right? If you're paying more than 30% of your income on your housing, you start to make sacrifices around quality childcare and reliable transportation. We have a lot of families in this community paying more than 50% in order to secure that housing. And then you're making decisions around food and medicine. It really takes a toll on that family, and it's specifically around their ability to be stable in that housing and to sustain it, but for some sort of emergency. And I think that's where our investment in projects like Aaron's, where I would call his projects affordable, but what we really mean is they're income restricted and they're protected. So they go to families that are in those income brackets, and Homeport's able to secure that unit for that family at that price point, not exceeding that 30%. And so we have to put capital dollars into those projects. The city's been really robust in our bond capacity to be able to have dollars to get these projects across the finish line. And so as we look at all those different kind of programs and policies at the City of Columbus, understanding what it's going to take to add more of those units, add lots of just market rate units so we can alleviate the pressure, and then figure out how we have the conversation more broadly in our region with our neighbors in Franklin County and then also those that are outside Franklin County. And so that's really where the city's positioned. I have the privilege of doing that work. I'm a city planner by background and kind of landed my way into housing primarily through the work that I did before coming to the City of Columbus, which was at Ohio State, and getting to work with Michael for about a decade, investing in the Wineland Park neighborhood, which was really for me kind of that bellwether of the housing crisis that we're all facing today. Really faced that Wineland Park neighborhood a little bit early because of its position and its the changes that were occurring there, and our ability to invest in affordable housing there created a mixed income neighborhood that allows a lot of opportunity for families to live near Ohio State, have access to jobs and education in a way that the market wasn't going to naturally provide. And the privilege of being able to take that knowledge and expand it out to the city and the region is the opportunity I have working at the City of Columbus. So always excited to have these conversations with the community around what's facing our housing.
Great. Thank you, Erin. I also failed to do a proper introduction of myself. I work at United Way of Central Ohio, and while we do not invest directly in housing-related work, we serve families that are earning at 200% of the federal poverty level, and we invest in 75 nonprofits in Franklin County. All of the families that are being served by our 75 funded nonprofits are struggling to be stable in their housing, and that is why affordable housing is such an essential part of the conversation for us. So, or I should say, Ms. Prosser, you identified affordable housing as people paying no more than 30% of their income toward a housing. Erin, I would like for you to describe what does that look like for the Homeport profile? What typically is the income for families that you're serving? What are the typical rents that you would be charging families relative to if they were navigating the open market?
Yeah. So, Erin started to address this, that affordable housing means something different to many different people. And that's changed a lot over the past, say, 10 years, particularly in Metro Columbus, as housing prices have increased, as Michael was describing in his slides. For a long time, the question of affordable housing was focused on perhaps a narrower band of the population, and now it's not. And that's why you hear, I don't know, the four of us or presidential candidates talking about it during their debates, which is very rare. I often say at Homeport we build affordable housing with a capital A and a capital H, because it is still focused on a subset of people who are probably more vulnerable. There's a wide range within that. I use the capitalized terms because our properties that we develop, a whole wide range of apartment types, are restricted, for the long-term future. So even if the market around those buildings is changing, these homes remain affordable. And to do that, they're often financed with different types of funding from the federal government, the state government, and the local government, especially so. Yeah, thanks, Erin. Yeah, and thanks to the City of Columbus. So we often are targeting with how our rents are structured and how they're meant to really be below market to people who range from folks who might be homeless if they didn't have this apartment available to them, all the way up through just regular folks who work in maybe retail, hospitality, or other service businesses who are feeling a lot of pressure from the overall housing market. I'm trying not to say area median income, but perhaps that's inevitable. That's a term that references, as the name implies, what people or what households make throughout Columbus. And we're usually targeting in our developments people who earn no more than 60% that translates to a family of 4, about $60,000 a year, family of 3, about $50,000 a year, but often our tenants, our residents, in some instances earn substantially less, and sometimes they earn right around that amount.
And Aaron, how many units does Homeport own, and then how many do you manage? Is that number different?
Sure. That number is about the same. So we, as an organization, own about 45 properties of like multifamily housing throughout Metro Columbus. Most of it is within Columbus proper. There are about 3,000 apartments across all those properties, and they take all different shapes and sizes. There are single-family homes, more suburban-looking properties, and then we just recently, about 6 months ago, finished construction on a 4-story building in Franklinton that's lot line to lot line and 100 units per acre of density. So pretty dense and urban. So it takes all different sizes, and we're the with business partners who we hire to manage the properties, the long-term manager for 30 years. We've owned pretty much every property we've ever built, still going back to 1990.
Michael says I can ask Aaron a question. So if I was driving down the road, Aaron, would I be able to definitely point out a Homeport property versus a market rate property?
Well, most of our properties have a sign that say owned by Homeport, so yes, but no. I mean, I think in the history of affordable housing, right, there's a lot of debate or terms, there are words that people throw around, right? Probably, maybe we all come here with a certain association. When you're at a public hearing, probably other people are coming with their own associations. But I think whether it's Homeport or other peers or competitors who work in the same business in Metro Columbus, or everyone nationally has placed a really high emphasis on quality of design, about contextualizing our work and our design. There are no more, Corbusian towers in the sky, and really haven't been for 60 years. And very focused as well on management. There's a lot of people, a lot of companies looking over every affordable housing owner's shoulders in terms of how a property's managed.
So I want to jump in if you'll let me. One of the things we started doing is a tour around Columbus for our elected officials and policymakers and just folks who care about housing, where we go to different affordable housing complexes. And we're talking about things that have a government subsidy attached to them. So just not naturally cheaper, but things that have been made cheaper because of public policy. But we don't tell people where we're going. And I'm just walking down the street. I'm like, all right, we're going to turn left. And they'll all look at me and be like, that building? That super nice one with like the artist housing and all of the flourishes, and it's just, we call it the hiding in plain sight tour, because legitimately you are walking down the street and you can't tell where it is. I live out in Reynoldsburg, and everybody who comes to visit me has to pass through a Homeport property to get there, and they constantly ask me, how much do those homes sell for, and how often do they go for sale? I'm like, that's low-income apartments.
So Carla, when you think about the years you've been doing advocacy around affordable housing, it's a very different environment now than a few years ago. When you're painting that picture to community leaders, how have you painted that picture differently today than just a few years ago?
So I think one of the things that's interesting is that it's also cumulative. It's not like you can chunk out and be like, oh, well, the 1990s were different, the 2010s were different. All of the problems that we've had, at least in my housing career, have been partly the cause of the one that comes next and the one that comes next. So when we were working during the Great Recession, a lot of the homeowners that I was representing were just solid middle-class folks who had solid middle-class jobs, and then the economy fell out from underneath them. And they couldn't afford their mortgage payments anymore. Well, one of the things that happened as a result of that is people stopped buying housing. We were not issuing mortgages as we had before then. So what happened as a result of that? A lot of construction companies went out of business. A lot of small contractors and electricians and carpenters, they all went out of business. And what happened as a result of that? Well, we built even less housing because now we don't have the folks to do it. And then as a result of that, we're sitting here today where we have 80,000 fewer homes than we need to. And you can't kind of stop and say, well, that was an isolated problem and it was the result of XYZ. It's all been this totality of choices and policies that we've made. I think one of the biggest things that I think sits me back and kind of startles me is if you rewind to the 1970s, we were building 200,000, 300,000 homes every year during the 1970s that were starter homes for young baby home buyers.
And that's nationally?
Nationally. You know how many we did 2 years ago? 65,000 for the entire country. Like, if every Ohio State grad got their degree and they're like, I'm gonna go buy a home, we'd be like, can't. We didn't build enough of them in the entire country for just the graduates of Ohio State to be able to start that journey.
So this question's for anyone on the panel. How did we get to where we are both as a nation and as a city? Because this issue around housing scarcity is very new. 10 years ago, we would have all been having conversations about the proliferation of vacant and abandoned housing and how that was hurting neighborhoods. So how did this happen so quickly?
I'll piggyback off what Carly was talking through, and it is this cumulative, probably over the last 100 years of policy decisions. As you look at kind of the earlier 20th century, you look at really race-based policies, where the Supreme Court said you can't actively go out and discriminate against folks based on race to where they can live. And so a lot of communities got really creative about how they then could by proxy restrict who was allowed in their communities. And they did that by minimum lot sizes and minimum house sizes, which just drives the price up. And at the time, it was really effective that by proxy, by race, you can exclude folks from your communities. And the tools got really honed in, and they were prolific around the country. So you have that piece of it that starts to suppress housing construction in a lot of ways in those communities. That was part of, we talk about scarcity now and its impacts. Scarcity was the tool that a lot of communities used to drive up prices and keep folks out of living in those communities. As you fast forward into this century and you think about where we ended up in '08, it really was devastating for the construction and home building industries. We lost an entire generation of contractors and tradespeople that could come in and do this kind of work. We lost whole companies that used to deliver lots of units in our communities. And we talk about needing to build 21,000 units. You look back into the before 2008, even here in Central Ohio, and we were dang close to that. We were really getting close to that number before the '08 crisis. You add that plus, I think, just a general slowdown of that construction, and then you add the need for people to seek out opportunities are a lot more happening in our cities right now than historically has happened. And I use the example of Ohio State, and you've got a student who, say, is from Lorain, Ohio, or Marietta. They come to Ohio State and they get their degree. They're probably not going back to their community to get a job. They're probably staying here with us because that's where that opportunity is going to be. They're going to then take another housing unit, right? So you've kind of got this dual problem of a scarcity of new construction and also kind of a attraction into our cities where those job opportunities are that naturally pull people and families to our community. Both of those things now lead to a place where we don't have enough housing. And there's only so much we can do with partners like Homeport to sustain some families, but we will never subsidize our way out of this problem. And we have to be aware of the fact that I want our public dollars to go into supporting our most vulnerable and the folks that need our help the most. And I want the market to be able to supply housing for our registered nurses and our child care workers and the folks that we're really relying on. And if we could accelerate that construction, we can pick up a lot of that in there. Because the other piece of it that broke was just natural filtration. And as projects age, it's 10 or 15 years old, it starts to have kind of aged amenities maybe, the debt is off of the project, and we start to see more affordable rents. And when we lost that whole generation of housing after 2008, we lost that whole generation of that normal aging of those properties that would have provided that natural affordability. So it's a lot of things kind of all coalescing together to end up where we are. And I think, again, Columbus isn't alone in this, it's a national issue. And I think, for all of us to hear presidential candidates even mention the word housing feels really remarkable for all of us. And I think that's where it seems to have elevated in the conversation. Even just having conversations like this tonight is something that is really meaningful to be able to kind of elevate that conversation.
So Aaron, when Homeport is looking to be a developer, what are some of the biggest limitations? Is it availability of land, land cost? Is it construction cost? What are some of those difficulties in Homeport's ability to build more?
Sure, all of them in part. And again, when we as an organization are focused on serving a particular segment of the population, the rent is only going to be so damn high, to quote that candidate for governor in New York about 10 years ago. So, there's only so much revenue that we can earn. And that means that as land and construction costs increase, as they did very rapidly from 2020 to 2023, there's only so much gap we can bridge. So, I know it's going to cost, this number might be surprising, but I know it's going to cost Homeport about $300,000 to build an apartment. And we're only going to be able to raise about $80,000 on a loan to finance that construction. So we need about $220,000 to bridge that difference.
Per unit?
Per apartment, or even per single-family home that we might build and sell to someone, although the numbers look a little different. So there is a cap on what the state of Ohio is willing to devote to this to this public policy issue. It is, I'd say, I have worked in a few different states. It's and if there's a metric or a Foursquare chart of like high cost versus a lot of government support for housing, Ohio's probably sort of in the middle on cost and toward the bottom on support per unit for housing. Yeah.
And Aaron, what is the wait list, or how many applications would Homeport get a year versus how many units you would have available?
Sure. More than 1-to-1. Obviously, it's not a surprise. We generally have a wait list at every property we own. I mentioned there are about 3,000 apartments across 45 properties a few minutes ago. So each one has a wait list, and we go down them. When an apartment opens, when we opened, we finished construction recently on a property with 50 apartments in the development, 50 homes, and we have about 200 names left over, so to speak, after having leased all the apartments, to where we can now call them and say, hey, we have more homes being built if you're still interested.
So I think to globalize that beyond just kind of the Homeport experience and to look at Central Ohio as a whole, we only have 26 homes for every 100 extremely low-income families who need one. So 75% of our housing need is going unmet every single day. Every day you wake up, and 1 in 4 people get the home that they need. And that's a really terrifying statistic, because as of last year, it means that we officially have more housing scarcity than the city of New York. And whenever you're comparing your housing market to New York City or Los Angeles or Denver, Colorado, Austin, it's terrifying. Yeah.
So, Carly, one of the huge successes that the Affordable Housing Alliance and you personally have had over these last couple of years is your advocacy around source of income protections. Could you tell us what that is, what communities have supported that, including Bexley, which was first in that effort to approve source of income protections, and what does it mean to folks, and how do you think that will ultimately better serve low-income and moderate-income families in Columbus?
Well, I mean, first, I appreciate you contextualizing this as somehow my success, but it's not at all. It's 10 cities across Franklin County who've done something really remarkable for their people. And it's a little weird. It's a little bit of a sleeper issue. But if you walk into an apartment complex and you're like, hey, I would like to rent that apartment, almost every property manager is going to be like, okay, how do you earn your income? And what most folks don't know is a landlord can refuse to rent to you, not because you don't have enough money, but because they don't like who your employer is or how you get your check. So there are tons and tons of employers in our community who admittedly, through survey responses, say, as a matter of principle, I don't rent to people who get child support income. I don't believe it, don't think it's sustainable. If you're getting child support, you just cannot live here. The same thing for people who receive Social Security or disability. The same thing for people who receive housing vouchers, which is ludicrous to me because that is the most guaranteed income stream you're ever going to get. Every month, like clockwork, the check just shows up. There's zero risk to it. And you're seeing this same phenomenon come up now in weirder ways and different ways, especially as our housing market gets so bonkers. So like now we're hearing a lot of landlords who say, well, I don't rent to anybody in the gig economy. You drive for Uber, you get 1099. I don't do it as a matter of policy. And that's because there's so much interest and so much demand for housing that property managers can be as exclusive as they want to be, because for every one person they turn down, there's 9 others in line. That whole ball of wax is source of income discrimination. I'm not discriminating against you arguably because of your race or your gender or your ethnicity. I'm doing it because of how you earn income. The problem, though, is that oftentimes that is a proxy for already illegal kinds of discrimination. So we know, for instance, that women are more likely to receive child support. So when you say, I don't take child support, you might not be saying, I don't rent to women and I don't rent to single moms, but that's what the practical ramification is a lot of the time. So these 10 communities, which now represents 85% of all Franklin County residents, so just a huge sum of us, are now protected by anti-discrimination laws that says a landlord can still refuse to rent to you because you don't have enough income, but they can't cherry pick who your employer is, and they can't cherry pick how you earn that income. And in fact, there are only 2 communities who have not yet passed the ordinance, but both of whom are considering it, and it's the city of Hilliard and Grove City. Everybody else, Bexley was absolutely first, Columbus was the biggest, but it's Whitehall and Westerville and Worthington, and it's Gahanna and Grove. Oh gosh, I'm gonna get them all wrong, so I'm not gonna do it now. But it's been phenomenal, and that was a 0 to 60 kind of movement. You rewind 3.5 years ago, it was nobody. Nobody had that, and now it's hundreds of thousands of people who are protected.
I'm also just glad we mentioned that in general, because we talk a lot about supply, but there are also all these various, what I'll call demand side issues. If, I'm using demand very broadly as a term, but just other ways to make housing accessible or open to people that already is there, but they might not be able to get to without legislation like that.
In about 20 minutes, we're going to open the conversation to all of you, so be thinking about what questions you might want to ask any of the panelists. So this will be for each of you. What worries you the most about the current trajectory that Central Ohio is currently on with regard to housing? Start with you, Ms. Prosser.
I mean, depending on what day you ask me, I can come up with a different answer for this. But what's on my mind right now is the response that the market's going to find a response, right? And so when we think about some of the neighborhoods I'll start with Columbus first, where you have these neighborhoods where you're seeing kind of the NIMBY response to some of the density or some of the apartment buildings that are getting built. And some of that fear is around, and Michael knows how I feel about this word, but some of that fear is around gentrification. And I think what we misunderstand is that they feel like they're kind of keeping that luxury building out of the neighborhood, and thereby keeping the economics of the neighborhood from changing. And the actual result is that luxury market will find its way, and where it goes is in the existing stock. And so what those folks will do will take units that our neighbors live in today, renoviction, and make that market viable in that place one way or the other. And so I think we have to have an understanding that by blocking what we would refer to as a luxury building does not keep that from happening in the neighborhood. It simply relocates it to the existing stock, and that's where you get displacement. I think the other piece of it is that we think if we just don't build anymore that people won't come. And as we see those construction starts, not keeping pace in Franklin County, we see an uptick in our far ex-urban areas, right? We see those other places where they have other water and sewer systems where they're allowing more construction to happen. And what that means is sprawl. That means loss of farmland. That means more personal vehicles on the road. That means traffic congestion for all of us. It means families having to drive 60 minutes one way to get to their job. thereby taking them out of their family time and their ability, and also adding to the transportation burden of that family. So the market will respond at some point, and what we're going to have is an unlivable community for all of us collectively. We're going to have a lot more of our existing units get rent-evicted into a much higher standard that our neighbors can't afford. And then we're going to have those folks needing to drive 60 minutes to get an affordable housing unit because they're being built so far away. And what we're going to have is the circumstance that they have in Austin now that you see in a lot of these communities where it's not just that the higher prices are strapping us. And if you own your home and you're securely in your space, you might not feel like this affects you, but the consequences are coming. And I think that's where we have to be realistic about, we don't have the level of control we think we do. And I think we have to be able to respond and figure out, how do we want to chart our future then? What does it look like for Central Ohio to build differently, and to figure out how we do it well so that my neighbors can stay in their houses, I live on the Near East Side, and that they don't have to assume a huge commute and a transportation cost burden in order to be able to afford housing. So it's kind of a roundabout answer, but I think what that overall development pattern that we're sort of by default entering into by not engaging in the conversation around growing up instead of out and figuring out how we do it well, that is going to have a consequence for all of us. And there is not an option where we just set this community in amber and nothing changes. And so we have to kind of have more realistic, open conversations about what that looks like.
Carly, Aaron, what about the current trajectory has you most concerned?
Sure. I was going to start where Aaron ended, which is about a sprawl, essentially, that, if someone currently lives in X neighborhood of Columbus, they probably work relatively close to where they live. But if, and especially if they live in one of those neighborhoods that was highlighted in a, bolder color on Michael's map 35 minutes ago, they're more likely being displaced to somewhere, outer Franklin County, Licking County, and so on. If vehicle miles traveled is increasing, greenhouse gas emissions are increasing. There is a lot, vehicles and buildings are two of the largest drivers of climate change. Actually, as much as we don't want to become New York City is actually one of the greenest places in the U.S. For those reasons. But also, I think, historically, like community networks or service networks are built around the idea that they're there to serve people in the major city itself. So if people are more dispersed through, Newark, Delaware, or all the small towns in between those two places, it is much harder to reach people where they are and, support them however they might need.
So anxiety is my superpower. I got a whole list of things that are scaring me. I come from Northeast Ohio. That's where I was born and raised. I know you're a Youngstown fella yourself. So I got Rust Belt mentality, and I see what happens to communities when we lose the jobs. And housing is an economic development issue. If employers do not have an affordable and decent place for their staff to live, they will not bring their employment opportunities to our community. And when you lose the jobs and you lose the housing, you lose your way of life. There is a cultural aspect to that that's just very, very difficult and demoralizing for communities to be able to withstand. So that's one. I would also say, too, that one of the ways that we've kind of been adapting to the low-level crisis we've had for years is that we're just kind of delaying life events. So especially when you're looking at younger folks, it used to be relatively typical that you would buy your home when you're, 26, 27, 28, your starter home, and you'd move on. Well, that was an incredibly important clock to start ticking, because then you pay your mortgage for 30 years, and when you're ready to retire, you don't have a mortgage, and your retirement income can pay your housing costs. Well, when you're delaying home ownership until you're in your 40s, and now you're paying a mortgage until you're in your 70s, what are you doing? Are you just working straight through 40 hours a week on that delaying of life events, I think, is really metaphysical for our young people, and it's gonna be a challenge that we haven't had and that our ancestors can't relate to at all. It's brand new. I think climate change is another one, and I'm not a climate girly, so I can't drop the stats on this the way that other folks can. But if the way that some people are projecting that parts of the South become uninhabitable, they're deserts, they're droughts, they're unfarmable, we are in an ice age trajectory where we are seeing a great migration that nobody has written about because nobody was able to write during the last one, you know, and I don't know if our cities in the north, which would be refugee centers, are resilient enough to be able to understand how to deal with that and flexible. And that's ideally a non-issue, or at worst case scenario, an issue for 50, 60 years from now. But we got to start planning 56 years from now today. That'll keep me up at night, but
That'll do it.
I'm trying.
So it's been mentioned more than once about the fact that housing has now come up in the presidential debate. But if the three of you think about where are you most hopeful that housing solutions will be more accessible, the federal level, the state level, local, municipal level, or the regional level, where do you think you'll see the greatest movement to help ease this pressure?
Yes. It's all of them, and
and
it's
are
got to
there
be all of them.
specific places that where the feds, state, local, or regional that you'd like to see a policy enacted that might be percolating that you think will dramatically improve our future situation?
Yeah, and I think this is where housing gets pegged as complicated because each of those different layers of government has to take a different part of the problem. It's not that it's really hard to decipher, it's just that it's kind of bifurcated out to different spots. The federal government, I think, is really the place where extremely low-income folks, right, those who are unable to work because they're aged or because they're disabled, that's where you need a federal government size investment because it's quite expensive, and to do that at the local level can be challenging unless you're dealing with very specific populations. I think that one of the things that gives me a lot of hope at the federal level, weirdly enough, is that the Trump tax cuts are expiring. So we're going to be talking tax policy, like it or not, next year. And it is a huge opportunity to reassess how are we incentivizing homeownership, right? How are we incentivizing housing construction? How are we supporting our families? I think the state also is really exciting. The Ohio Senate just released a whole report on like 27 different ways that they can do better for housing. The Republican Senate, right? Bipartisan document. It doesn't matter if you're red or blue. They got 27 killer ideas. One of them that we know the state is really the only place that can assess is homeowner property taxes. That is state policy. And as our home sale prices go up and our home values go up, our taxes are all going up. And there are a lot of, especially fixed income seniors, not exclusively, but a lot, who are going to start to feel pushed out of the neighborhoods that they helped build. We need the Ohio House and Senate to be able to address that, and they've got it on. They've got a committee, they're talking about it right now. I think that gives us as advocates a forum to go and say, here's my experience, here's my suggestion, and for all of us to rally in support of that work. I could go for local all night because that's where the Alliance lives and breathes, but these guys, I want to hear from myself.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, probably at the local level. I mean, I think still at the local level, partisan divide is not as crystallized as it is at the state or federal level. That might generally be changing when you talk on a national level. But I think when you look at the local level, pretty much every mayor and city council in Franklin County is talking often and loudly. And in various ways, with the tools they have, you know, putting their money where their mouth is and backing up what they're saying to actually make changes. You know, the city of Columbus is doing it at a greater scale because it's by far the largest city in Franklin County. But you know, I mean, but Carly's right. You know, I don't know how much folks pay attention to the Ohio legislature, but they have actually approved programs over the past 2 years, mostly through new tax credits, to build more affordable homes, whether they're for rent or for sale. And yeah, I mean, on a state level, it's really not a partisan issue in the way that we think so many policy issues have a, you know, red or blue response to them. The state of Montana has passed within the past few years statewide zoning reform, and the city of Minneapolis has done the same, and the city of Columbus did too, obviously 3 months ago. Those are all very different places on the spectrum.
So I'm going to then redirect the question to Ms. Prosser specifically about zoning, take you to the local level. Aaron, you just referenced that the city of Columbus in July, for the first time in 70 years, changed its zoning code on 140 miles of the major commercial corridors like Main, Cleveland Avenue, West Broad, High Street, where they were previously zoned for 6,000 units of housing. They're now zoned for 88,000 units of housing. What does that mean to the regional issue around affordable housing? What else might be coming beyond just this 140 miles that has been rezoned, which was significant, but that was only 5% of the city that got rezoned? And how has Columbus's rezoning been an inspiration, or has it been an inspiration for other suburban communities to look at their zoning code and whether or not their zoning codes are pro-housing or not?
I mean, as you think about, one of the challenges we have is how localized our solutions to housing are, right? And we sort of, for me, it really is, the housing market itself is a regional situation. I mean, it doesn't really care about jurisdictional boundaries, and it functions, or should function, like a part of our infrastructure. And it should be treated like roadways and utilities, where we have organizations that think about them at the regional level and plan for them at the regional level. There is not that entity today, although there is work being done to figure out what that could look like. How do we have a lens that allows all these pieces and parts to fit together? And I think what the mayor of Columbus, Mayor Ginther, has been really strong about is leading that conversation. And I think for us, updating the zoning code was a big lift. It was the first time in 70 years. But we had a council and a mayor that aligned together to say the priorities and values in the city of Columbus do not look like they did 70 years ago. And we have a code that is driving our development that is based on priorities and values from 70 years ago. That doesn't align with where we are. And we wanted to think about the place differently. And we wanted to really shift our thinking away from growing out and really thinking about growing up, and doing it in the places that are most able to handle density, right? It's along our major transit corridors. It's aligned with economic opportunities and where jobs and education are, to allow housing to get built by right. And because what stalls a lot of the housing construction is sort of the pathway to get the approval. And even if you ultimately get the approval, the time and resources dedicated to it is extraordinary. So I think building more housing is really important, and allowing it to be more flexible. And so when we talk about that, the big developers we have in Columbus have figured out how to navigate our process. They get things built, right? If they have a really big project, they can hire architects and engineers and attorneys to navigate the crazy system that was what we had along our corridors. The folks that struggle to get projects done are the ones that are 20 units or 30 units. Those things are almost impossible to do when you layer on that approval process. The deal becomes undoable. You can't make the numbers work. They can't always bring in all those professionals to help navigate that space. And so what we lose is that diversity of housing types, right? There's a lot of frustration people have around, it's all these 5/1s, right? Which is the kind of big, massive apartment buildings. But that's because our codes were so challenging. That's the only thing that economically made sense to actually get done. And what we wanted to say was, we're going to eliminate along these corridors, we're going to collectively go through a process with the community to say we want to have a different allowable construction on these corridors. If you want to go outside of that, you still have to come and get a rezoning or a variance, but we're gonna increase what's available and what you can do without having that. And I think it's going to allow more housing to get built. It's going to allow a lot more diversity of our developers. We're going to see smaller developers that are far more diverse, both gender and race. It's going to allow them to enter the space and build something that people can actually live in a place that we all collectively agreed was where it's most responsible. I think as we looked at what the capacities were, the old zoning code, I used to have to say the current zoning code, the old zoning code would have allowed for 6,000 units on our most prominent corridors, which is a ridiculously low number. And we look over the next 10 to 15 years, collectively as a region, we need to build about 200,000 units to keep pace and make up for what we underbuilt, as we talked about earlier. And I think that 6,000 gets to be a pretty small contribution for the city. And when we look at what we could now build, and the capacity study based on market conditions would be 88,000 units. That's a really remarkable contribution to that 200,000 unit need. We'll see kind of how it lives and breathes. It took effect at the beginning of September. We have projects already down with our building and zoning services that are taking advantage of the new code. We're excited to see kind of what those outcomes are. And I think hoping that can help show, I think, that the density in those investments are beneficial to the communities and actually lend a better condition, and that the new buildings aren't necessarily a bad thing. And I think so much of what we've done with housing over the years is trying to manage the impacts, right? We have managed the traffic they will generate and the parking they will create, and there are all the negative things that housing is we're sort of trying to find a way to manage our way out of. We have to start talking about what the opportunities of new housing are. They are customers for our small businesses. You want coffee shops, you want to walk to a corner grocery, you want those kinds of amenities in your neighborhood, they have to have customers, and they have to live nearby. And so as we increase those folks, we get more small businesses and support for entrepreneurship. That's really amazing. And good transit needs lots of riders. And so if we think about the investment we're going to make, God willing, in less than a month, we'll have Wilkos on the ballot here in Franklin County. If we make that commitment as a community to support robust transit in our city, we need those riders. And that's why we coupled that zoning increase along those transit corridors so that we could have a robust transit system that functions. You have to have both. You can't just lay the lines or add the buses. You have to have the riders as well. And so what we're hopeful is we'll see those positive outcomes. We can have conversations with our neighboring communities about what really happened when we had this investment in housing.
So we're going to open it up for questions from you with one last question for each panelist, so be thinking of your questions. We've talked a little bit tonight about a lot of the not in my backyard or NIMBY movement that is often the case when you go to any commission meeting or zoning meeting. Typically who shows up are the people who don't want to see it. What is one way you each think we can begin to move from a not in my backyard to a yes in my backyard? Just about a week ago or so, there was a film at the Lincoln Theater that was focused on the homelessness epidemic across the country called Beyond the Bridge. And there was a line in the film where a person said, if we don't want affordable housing in our backyards, we will have homeless in our front yards. So how can we move to YIMBY? And then we'll turn it over to you. Carly.
So I think one of the things we've kind of done a disservice to when we talk about housing and housing affordability in particular is we kind of have couched it as like, oh, this gift to somebody who's lower income or somebody who is in need, and it's kind of this charitable approach, and that's good and that's appropriate, and I think that's historically accurate. But what we've done a really bad job at is talking about how investing in housing that's affordable is good for all of us, myself included. And I'm not cost burdened, I'm not housing insecure, but if we fix this problem, I'm gonna get perks all day, every day, and really sizable ones. When Aaron talked about having the amenities, right? Do you have the coffee shops? Do you have the grocery stores? That's all a function of whether or not we have the right homes. But there's a ton of other ways to think about these benefits. And we commissioned a report last year to put numbers to that. And we went to our researchers, to our scientists, and we said, I want you to pretend that Franklin County cuts its housing gap in half. Don't tell me how, just pretend we wake up tomorrow and instead of there being 50,000 folks who are in a bad spot, you've only got 25,000. And now tell me, in that world, what does our economy look like? What does our healthcare and our community wellness look like? And what does our education system look like? And the results were phenomenal. The one that blows me away, I think, the most is that if we were to do that, if we did just half of what we should be doing anyways, there are 5 school districts in Franklin County alone that would raise their state report card grade by an entire letter. So I'm sitting here in Reynoldsburg, a C school district. If I wake up tomorrow and I'm in a B district, that is fantastic for my son. who for some reason is filming right now. Yep. So that's education, right? On the economy. The report found that doing half of what we should be doing will create 40,000 jobs per year for the region as a whole, the 11-county region of Central Ohio. That's the equivalent of an Intel in each county. Every year, you get an Intel, Oprah Winfrey style. You get the economic impact of a massive economic stimulus. That's shared prosperity. That's jobs. That's relevancy. That's China-proof. That's whatever the thing is you're worried about for the future. That's how we solve it. And I'll say, too, we were going through this research report, my mom got sick and I lost her. And I'm getting to a place where we can talk about that, and I'm not going to start bawling. But it was really personal and really emotional for me to think about the health ramifications, the health impacts as we were doing this report, because one of the findings was that if we did cut our gap in half, we would gain 5 years of life. 5 birthdays, 5 Christmases, 5 New Years. And there's no number you can stick on that, but we all get that. So I think one of the ways to answer the question more frankly, we get around NIMBY and we get to something more positive is we get selfish about it. I want 5 more years with my family. I don't need to apologize that I'm doing this for self-interest. That's why we do good things in this country. Also, we're good people, but self-interest helps.
That was a good answer. Yeah, I'm not sure I have too much to add. How do we go from NIMBY to YIMBY? I mean, this is mostly like, unfortunately, maybe for better or worse, like, really takes people who are interested to come out, right? It's a pretty niche topic. I find it very hard. I think it's a marketing, there's almost a marketing issue I find in my career. I don't speak a marketing language, and most of my colleagues don't either. And there is a salesmanship about it, like Carly was saying, to talk about this from the, from the enrichment, monetary and, otherwise, as opposed to the lack of that's needed.
And I'll just quickly add, I think I was reading a book recently where they kind of flipped it on its head, and instead of NIMBY or YIMBY, it's already in my backyard. These folks are your neighbors. These folks that need affordable housing are in your community. They're in your life right now. They're watching your children during the day. They're going to draw your blood next time you're at the hospital. These are not other kinds of people. These are people you know today. Childcare workers, social workers, medical technicians in hospitals, everybody that we all collectively rely on to have a high quality of life here in the city means that those folks need to have sustainable, stable housing in order to be sustainable, stable employees. And we have to understand that these are not these other people that we don't already know. They're folks, and quite honestly, for a lot of folks in neighborhoods, they'll be the children that are being raised today, right? I mean, you won't be able to afford for your kids to buy a house in the city. You're going to be way out in the suburbs again. I think those are the impacts that we have to start getting real about. The fact these are people in our lives today. They are already in our backyard. And building new housing so that they can have safe and stable places to live is what we should be doing as a collective community that's growing. The alternative is we're not growing. And as Carly mentioned earlier, that is not a good scenario for us. That is not a trajectory that feels good for Central Ohio. And there is no circumstance in which we just stay the same. We have 2 paths, and I think as we grow, we're going to need to find ways to make sure that everyone in our community has safe and stable housing. And that means the folks that are already in our backyard. And I think Aaron's boss, Leah, often cites the folks that are in your communities are often coming from within the communities where they're built. These are not people coming into their communities from some other place. They're really having the opportunity through the Homeport development to have a safe and stable place in the community where they already live.
Aaron, I was struck by you saying about 60% area median income for your properties. Any one of us who's ever gone out to dinner at a sit-down restaurant just came into contact with someone who needs a 40% area median income unit or a deeply affordable unit, which are very rare to find. because the average wage of a cook at a sit-down restaurant is $29,000 a year, and you will not navigate the Columbus housing market on $29,000 a year. So with that, what is on your minds? I will come down with this microphone. Who has a question for the panelists? Oh, Zach has a microphone. Michelle.
Surprise. I don't really need this, as you know. So hi, guys. Hi, you guys all know me. I am a recovering housing expert and now re-terrified and re-hopeful. So thank you for all the work you're doing. It's absolutely amazing and incredible. I want you to talk a little bit, as you know what I'm going to say. I think we need to be really clear with this community about what's going to happen with our homeless population if we don't take action and we don't become YIMBYs. Because you made a comment, Michael, and I thought that was so, it's either in my backyard or on my front porch. How do you want it? And when we talk about all the benefits of housing, you know, even if we just brush aside the deep suffering of vulnerable people who are not having their most basic needs met, all the rest of the community suffers as well in all the ways that they suffer. And I think people need to understand that. The question, so I want you to speak to that a little. The question I want to ask is, what are we willing to do that is radically innovative to change this trajectory? Because we're doing a lot of really good stuff, like a lot of other communities, and so we're sailing along this flight path. We need to pull the nose up on that plane. So, and you may talk about it in a way of, if I lived in utopia, what? But what are we ready to radically innovate to fix what is ailing us?
Oh, I'll go. I want to put the number out there because we do need to be really explicit about what's coming, and we can't toe around it. The shelter board just released the result of an 18-month analysis on where we're heading. And if we don't do something drastic in the next 3.5 years, unsheltered homelessness, the folks who you see sleeping outside, that is going to increase 68% in an incredibly short time. I don't think radical solutions are exactly needed to fix that particular problem, because they did a cost analysis. What would it take not just to stop that from happening, but then to drop unsheltered homelessness by 80%? So not just getting less bad, but getting much, much better. And it's $137 million. I come from housing, so I talk in billions, and that number doesn't scare me. But for context, the public investment in map-free stadium was more than that. Wonderful investment, fantastic team for our community. The Worthington Mall transformation, that cost more than that. We have done this in so many ways and shapes, and we are so capable of doing it. And that public-private partnership that Columbus has perfected means that it is really not challenging to address that problem. On innovation and transformation, if I can continue just for one more second, the one place that my brain went right away is Convergence Columbus. Has folks heard about this? I'm going to skip outside of homelessness land and talk about home ownership. In Columbus, there is a 32% gap between the white home ownership rate and the black home ownership rate inside one relatively small city. It is a night and day experience, depending exclusively on your race. About 3 years ago, a coalition of what's now 120 different organizations came together and said, we can do better than that. That's bull. And they have adopted innovation-only approach, right? Everything they do, it's pilot this, pilot this. We heard a rumor, let's try it. We found something, let's give it a swing. We'll study the hell out of it, and if it works, we'll scale it, and if not, we tried it, it was worth it. We learned something, we'll do it differently. And in just 3 years, they have raised $6 million for down payment assistance that is exclusively available to first-generation homeowners. Those guys who don't get help from mom and dad to buy a home, to level that field. They have launched a totally neat website, Bloom 614, that is all interactive, and it is everything you need to know, soup to nuts, on how to buy a home. They've launched a fintech partnership to bring housing counseling into the 21st century and do it digital, because right now a lot of it is happening in the back of cubicles. They are working right now on a shared appreciation mortgage, which is the wonkiest, weirdest thing ever, and it's so neat, but it is a it's a mortgage you've never seen. It is a mortgage that you never pay on until you sell the home. And then instead of paying interest and fees, you just split the appreciation with the lender. So it's constantly perpetual. You never have to go and ask for more grants or more money. It just funnels itself. But it's not each of those programs. It's the fact that that's 120 folks who are the establishment of Columbus and who are the outsiders throwing rocks at it, and everybody coming together and saying, let's try it. And it's going really well. Sorry, I got on a little bit of a tangent.
Do you want me to?
So I think, as we look at this challenge, we've got kind of these long-term strategies in place around the zoning code update, the investment in affordable housing. These are long-term strategies that, over the next decade will pay off and allow us to have enough housing and support the families that can't afford the market. But in the meantime, we have a lot of families that are living on the edge. And for us, I think where the innovation is how do we keep people housed? How do we keep them from ending up homeless? How do we keep them in the unit they're in today? And so we do a lot of work with our low-income homeowners around home repair, critical home repair, and emergency home repair. Those are folks that own their house, they're paying their property taxes, but for a capital improvement like a roof or an HVAC replacement, might end up losing that house. If you are involved with code enforcement in the city of Columbus, there are funds that you can access if you're a low-income homeowner to make those repairs and get your house back out of code enforcement so that you don't end up having to sell it in order to deal with those code violations. We are looking at stable housing networks and eviction prevention and access to counsel and ways we can help stabilize families, because it is so tenuous if you're not the most perfect tenant. And by not being a perfect tenant, I mean, you might have small children, you might have animals, you might have like cats and dogs, you might have anything that ticks those boxes is going to make you a vulnerable renter, and not the least of which is just increasing rents in your building or rent evictions. Those are all ways those families just aren't stable. And I think going back to the convergence, we talk about home ownership in this community or in this country as a wealth building vehicle, which is true, but it is also a very stable part of being housed. When you sign that mortgage, unless you do something like take a home equity or something, that mortgage stays stable. Your property taxes may go up, but it's a relatively stable situation from a housing standpoint. And so investments in things like convergence and expanding the access to home ownership is going to be really meaningful. So I think for us, the innovations come in at how do we keep people housed? How do we identify where those unstable families are and intervene early so that they don't have to enter the shelter system, so that they don't have to be sleeping in their car in the Walmart parking lot? How do we keep them in that unit? Or most recently, we passed a relocation code where if it's a major apartment building that gets vacated because the city of Columbus goes in and says it's unsafe, those tenants, the landlord is now obligated under city code to pay for those relocation services for those residents. We are able to either we make them pay it in the moment, and if they are unwilling to do that, then we will pay for those relocations, and then we will go back and recoup that money from the landlord after the fact. So in the moment, they're going to have the opportunity to get back to the colonial village and the latitude where we really learned those expenses need to be incurred by the property owner. And so we put into city code that that's a requirement now. So those are kind of it's a lot of different pieces and parts, but just let's keep people in the houses they are in today.
To just add some data to the explosion of those experiencing homelessness in our community, which is about 2,800, 550 living on the land. For the longest time, if you became homeless in our community, we were getting you rehoused in 18, 19, 21, 22 days. And then it jumped to 35, and people thought that was an anomaly. And then it went to 52 the following year. The federal government says we expect communities get people rehoused within 90 days. Then that number in our community jumped to 80. We finished 2023 at 85 days. And so far this year, the community has been averaging over 100 days. If you now lose your housing and end up in our shelter system, you will now be in one of those shelters for 3.5 months, not 2.5 weeks, like what it was 6 or 7 years ago. That housing scarcity, that's an example of how that housing scarcity is just manifesting itself and pushing down that supply. Other questions from the audience? Yes, young person who happens to know one of the panelists.
My nickname is Easy. Almost nobody can pronounce my real name. My question is how much change would need to be done to have it done, and then which pulls the question, how much change have we already done?
I love this question. So on the how much change have we already done, there is a statistic that I want to put out that I think is really telling for the city of Columbus and Franklin County. When I came into this role about 4 years ago, we had 54,000 households, 54,000 families that were paying more than half their income towards housing, rent or mortgage. That's an incredibly unstable position to be in, not just for those individuals, but for the community at large. 54,000. Today, it is 52,000. That doesn't sound like moving mountains, but we are one of the only communities in the entire country who went down. And we did it during a pandemic, and we did it during an inflation crisis. So we got innovation in our blood. It's time to scale it and to take what we've learned and make it bigger. I will say, one of the things that I want to do is make sure that this is not a problem that we pass on to the next generation. So I would put a stopwatch out and say that I don't want to make this your problem. I want us to be able to deal with it.
And I think that in Central Ohio, one of the things that makes me most optimistic is the fact that we are addressing this issue before it is in full-blown crisis. A lot of the other cities waited until the housing impacts had expanded throughout the entire population before they started to make some of the interventions. And I think what we collectively as a community said, we're seeing these impacts on our most vulnerable. This is happening today. We are going to start to act. I mean, the City of Columbus residents have passed now 2 affordable housing bond packages totaling $250 million. That's really remarkable in a city that for mostly, I mean, compared to a lot of the nation, we're still really kind of affordable. We don't have the when you look at Austin, their average home price is double what we are. They have the same number of people in the city of Austin. They have the same number of people in the region. They have the same basic economic structure, big state university, state capital, kind of really similar in a lot of ways. The fundamental issue they have is they actually have fewer housing units than we do. And so what you end up with is a doubling of the housing price. And that's when they started to act. And they've done some of the work around bonding. They've done some work around zoning. It's not been super successful for them. But they sort of are coming into a place where their homelessness crisis is at a breaking point. And at that point, they started to act. And I think what makes me optimistic about Central Ohio is the communities here are standing up and saying, we're not going to wait that long. And we're going to make these interventions. We're going to make sure that we don't get to the crisis point. And we're going to see if we can change that trajectory. And going down to 52,000 is a marker of that investment.
Any other question from the audience? Steve.
Okay. I guess we've had a lot of great data, a lot of great insight into what's happening. What's the strategy? How are we coordinating the strategy between the city? I mean, no one's here from the county. They put out their blueprint. Mid-Ohio, last year, the year before, put out the housing, their housing report. So what is the strategy? I've got a second question after that. And what is and how are we ever able to do it beyond community by community? Is there any way to do it regionally?
I mean, I think that's the next place we have to go. I think as we think about affordable housing, so much of it is really, I think, traditionally been thought of as something that the city of Columbus manages and addresses. And I think what we know is that the impacts of the housing crisis extend far beyond the city of Columbus boundaries. And at the same tone, there is not enough land within the city of Columbus to build enough housing. That lift can't be done solely in the city of Columbus. It's just not possible. And so as we think about the collective conversations with our neighboring communities here in Franklin County and then out in the exurban communities, we start to see a real coalescence around this conversation. And I think as we look at the way we do things in Central Ohio, which is collectively and across jurisdictional boundaries, I think we have a real opportunity to think about housing that way too. And it's starting to be part of that collective conversation. And I think we'll see some infrastructure being built to look at it from a regional scale. And I think at times it seems like the other neighboring communities aren't going to participate with us. And in our conversations with those jurisdictions, they are very eager to figure out how they can be part of the solution. I think one of the examples I always use is in Hilliard. They have a site downtown Hilliard that is zoned for multifamily. It is supported by the community. They'd love to see more customers because they're revitalizing their downtown. The water line's too small. And a city like Hilliard can't bond the way the city of Columbus can to address some of those challenges. And so they're stuck with a fee that they can't put on the back of the project because there's not enough room in a pro forma to add it to the residential construction. But yet they themselves, as the city of Hilliard, don't have those resources. And so how do we collectively as a community start to think about how do we support those opportunities? How do we support those communities? City of Columbus, my job is to wake up every morning and think about housing, right? And that's a luxury that the city of Columbus has because we have the resources and size that we do. For a lot of communities, their staff is getting through the end of the month, and they're going through their applications, and there's not a lot of bandwidth left to think strategically about housing. And so is there something we could put in place at a regional scale that could help support those communities and some of that technical assistance, resource support? I think there is a lot of opportunity. We just don't have that infrastructure built right now.
I think one of the opportunities, and there's a lot of things that work really well at a regional level. I think fair housing is one. I think looking at incentives and economic development is one.
Yep.
One of the things that I think we really need at the regional level is education and data and statistics, so we're all singing from the same hymnal. And I'm not calling people out, but I think that there is something that is troubling that is happening in our community 40 minutes away from where we're sitting right now. The city of Newark is currently considering an ordinance and is expected to vote on it in 2 weeks that would criminalize the act of being homeless, that you would be punished with a 30-day jail sentence. And I joke, although it's not funny, it's possession of a blanket with intent to sleep. That's the ordinance. If we all in here and so many folks throughout the region, it's not just Franklin County, it's so many folks are tuned in and aware and talking about this, I think being able to bring everybody up to the same level is incredibly helpful.
We'll take this last question here.
How many homeless shelters are there for men in Franklin County? How many homeless shelters are there for women in Franklin County? How many homeless shelters are for women who have children in Franklin County? And how many total units are there among all in each category of homeless shelters? And what is the average wait for a homeless person to get in a homeless shelter in Franklin County right now?
Those are some specific questions, and I'm going to turn that over to Michelle, who for many years led our entire county and city shelter system called the Community Shelter Board. And while she has been removed from that job for 2 years, she's the most equipped in the audience to give that answer.
Okay, I have been gone for 2 years. So for men's shelters, we've got Lutheran Social Services, Faith Mission. We have Friends of the Homeless, the YMCA, and Volunteers of America, which is just veterans at this point. Then for women, we have Faith Mission, the YMCA. For families, we have the YMCA and the YWCA. And so that's the current shelter array. There's been a lot that's been added by the city in a different kind of way, and so I really couldn't speak to the number of slots that are available for folks. But that's what the shelter array looks like.
Michelle, what happens when each of those components for men, women, or families gets to full capacity? What happens?
Wait lists. Waiting lists. Yeah.
And where do people go?
They usually, when folks are single, so single men and women that are not accompanied by children, they almost always are men specifically are coming from the street. So the most common last night's sleeping arrangement was a place not meant for human habitation, which means a car under the bridge on a lawn. For women, it is less likely, but they are still mostly coming from places not meant for human habitation. For families, what they end up doing is doubling and tripling and quadrupling up. Very uncommon for a family to be coming off the land. It does happen. They tend to sleep in cars. They tend to sleep in parking lots under the Walmart lights. But they are then oftentimes in overcrowded and or unsafe situations because of having to do that for housing. Faith Mission sold their building on 8th, but what they did was build a new shelter that is much more conducive, a much, much better facility for the men and women. Yeah, exactly. So Faith on 8th continues to be there, but the one that was in the old church building that had the cross, that one was that was sold, and then a new shelter was built that was completely renovated, much better for folks.
Yeah, one quick question. Montgomery County, Maryland has a public housing revolving fund, $100 million. Are you familiar with it? Or you may be familiar with it, Aaron?
A little bit. I mean, Montgomery County, Maryland is kind of famous, yeah. At least in certain circles.
Exactly. Is that something? I mean, the city obviously passed two bond issues, but this is a $100 million revolving fund to do mixed use, where, according to the NPR report I heard, 25% are people, 50%, 25% of the persons in the unit, I think it was 436 units, 25% are up to 50% median income, another 5% are what they call workforce, up to 120% of median income in Montgomery County, and then the rest is basically market rate. And this is the second one there, well, one's built, this is under construction. Is that something, I've not heard anybody in Central Ohio. Now, Montgomery County, Maryland, if I'm not mistaken, has some different zoning. The laws are not the same in Maryland as they are in Ohio that allows them to do some things, I'm sure, that I don't know that we can do, but yeah.
I'll get at this from a certain angle. I mean, no one from the Columbus Metropolitan Housing Authority is like on stage right now, obviously, right. But if you're not familiar with the work they're doing, and I can speak of it only from observing it from the outside, they don't operate like people think of as a typical housing authority, in whatever memory that might be from 1964. They're developing all types of housing and using their bond capacity as a public agency to do it. And, those folks could pitch it a lot better than I am right now, but they're using their resources to think in that multi-tiered way. Yeah.
I think the other thing they're doing is also just acquiring. Yes. And working with what is naturally occurring affordability today in a lot of our communities, especially around high opportunities, and they're able to go in and acquire those units, leave the families there, secure the rents at a certain level, in a way that is not as well known as probably it should be, but at the same time it's not there's not necessarily something that impacts the neighborhood like new construction, so it's just quietly kind of stabilizing those apartment complexes through the work that CMHA is doing. I mean, I think the creative ways we can either preserve affordability and change it from a naturally occurring to something that is protected is really important. And then how we can support the work of Homeport and the other affordable housing partners that are members of AHACO is what we are looking for every day, and figuring out how can we contribute more. I was going to joke with you earlier that you don't have a section of Lowe's that's the affordable housing section where lumber's cheaper and everything's less expensive. I mean, all of our housing developers are facing the same challenges as our market rate developers, and so how do we continue to get them across the finish line is one of the challenges we have.
And also to give credit where due, the Montgomery model is kind of three-pronged, right? So it's public ownership, which means that you don't have to pay sales tax on materials. It couples a tax abatement, and it's a low-interest loan fund. We have all three of those components right now in Franklin County. You just got to go to 3 different groups to get it, but there are definitely people who know how to do that. I think Homeport has played with all 3 of those and combined them. So we don't have a gimmick to it. There's no jingle, but we're doing it.
I want to thank you all for coming out this evening. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you, to Bexley Library and Ben and Zach for always hosting great community conversations and bringing folks together to be educated, informed, and inspired. And thank you to Carly Booz, the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Alliance of Central Ohio, to Aaron Prosser, Deputy Director of Development for the City of Columbus, and Aaron Wasserman, Director of Real Estate for Homeport. Thank you all for being with us this evening. Thank you.
And thank you, Michael Wilkos, for organizing this panel and for moderating tonight.
Great, thank you so much. And I think the library is officially closed.